Chapter 201. Tournament. Varen. As Lyra stepped out of the ring, her movements graceful and measured, Marquis Venters admired quietly. Not bad. He turned slightly toward the elders at his side, his gaze flickering with a hint of appreciation. Indeed, he said, his tone smooth, almost indulgent. She is not only strong but truly striking to behold. A force of beauty and skill combined. Elder Shui allowed herself a rare smile, pride evident in her expression. "Thank you, Marquis," she replied, inclining her head slightly. "Our Lyra has worked hard to reach this level. Her diligence reflects the standards of our sect." Elder Kale, however, snorted derisively, his tone laced with contempt as he watched Lyra exit the arena. "Praise for a trifle," he muttered, his voice loud enough for both the Marquis and Elder Shui to hear. "It's hardly impressive to defeat a nameless whelp. Any true disciple of a proper sect wouldn't waste time on such a weakling." Elder Shui's smile thinned, her gaze icy as she glanced over at him. "A true disciple of our sect learns more than brute strength, Elder Kale. Discipline, poise, the very qualities you so clearly lack." Marquis Venter intervened smoothly, though the amusement in his eyes did not entirely mask his enjoyment of the tension between the two. But every match has its purpose. Even a minor contest can reveal much about a fighter's essence. Kale's lips twisted in a humorless smile, his gaze turning cold as he regarded Lyra's retreating form. "Essence, you say? It really is coming from someone like you?" His tone was mocking, and he was clearly implying. "Someone whose body has been touched everywhere." The moment Elder Kale's words lingered in the air, a biting chill settled over the lounge. The subtle, regal atmosphere seemed to shift, the temperature dropping as an unmistakable pressure filled the space. It was the unmistakable aura of a six-star awakened, Elder Shui's cold fury manifesting as frost edged along the corners of the room. Her voice was low and sharp, a warning that cut through the silence. "Watch your mouth, Kale." Elder Kale's smirk remained, unfazed by the sudden change in atmosphere. He met her gaze head-on, his stance unwavering as he dismissed the ice-laden pressure surrounding him with casual disdain. "And where," he sneered, his voice laced with mockery, "is this so-called essence? Now, Elder Shui?" Shui's eyes narrowed, her posture rigid as she held his gaze. The room seemed to tense, the air thick with her barely restrained anger. But Kale did not falter. He stood there, indifferent to her challenge, his smirk only deepening as he raised his chin slightly in defiance. Marquis Venter let a delicate, almost amused smile play at his lips. "Impressive, truly," he said, his tone dry yet measured, cutting through the tension with the ease of a master. "Both strength and restraint are admirable qualities, wouldn't you say?" Elder Shui's aura retreated slightly, though her eyes remained sharp as she looked at the Marquis, her fury tempered but not fully quenched. Elder Kale chuckled softly, a look of smug satisfaction on his face. He had proven his point, at least in his own mind, and did not need any further words. The Marquis watched them both, his gaze thoughtful. This wasn't just about the disciples in the arena. It was a reminder of the unspoken battles waged between the sects and the delicate balance of power that governed these ancient rivalries. As Marquis Venter's gaze lingered on the figure entering the arena, he recognized a stark contrast to Lyra's poised elegance. This young man, cloaked in a silvery red robe that caught the light like embers against steel, radiated a fiercer energy. His expression was serious, his jaw set in a look of cold determination that mirrored the intense aura around him. He moved with a controlled yet volatile presence, as if restraining a fire within. This was Varen Drakov, the senior disciple of the Silver Flame sect and one of their most promising talents. His every step was purposeful, his silvery red robe a striking mark of his allegiance and status within the sect. The crowd's reaction was immediate, a mixture of awe and anticipation. They knew of Varen's reputation, of his merciless skill and the passionate ferocity that defined the Silver Flame sect's approach to combat. Marquis Venter noted the rigid, focused expression on Varen's face, a mask of cold resolve that hinted at the underlying tension between him and Lyra. The rivalry between their sex was well known, but between these two, it was more personal, far deeper and more intense than the usual tournament rivalries. Elder Kale's gaze held a hint of satisfaction as he watched his prized disciple take his place. "There he is," he murmured with pride barely concealed. "Now, this is true strength." His voice was calm, but the undertone of vindication was unmistakable. Marquis Venter's interest deepened as he watched the young man's approach. This promised to be a far different match than the ones before. Not only a showcase of strength, but also a clash of ideals and personal vendettas simmering beneath the surface. Elder Schwe's gaze hardened as she regarded Varen stepping into the arena, her lip curling slightly in distaste. "Nothing but a brute," she remarked icily, her voice low yet clear, acting on a whim, lacking restraint. "A reckless fire, nothing more." Elder Kale let out a soft, derisive chuckle, shaking his head with a look of bemusement. "Brute? You misunderstand, Schwe." His tone was calm, edged with pride. "The silver flame sex fire doesn't just burn anyone. It only consumes those deserving of its heat. We wield our strength with purpose, calling us brutes, while pursuing carnal desires under the guise of discipline. Now that is hypocrisy." Elder Schwe's expression turned even colder, her posture rigid. "We pursue mastery in all its forms, Kale. The Cloud Heavens sect is not so shallow as you imply." Elder Kale's smirk lingered, his gaze sharp as he leaned slightly forward. "Mastery in all its forms, Tell me, Schwe, does that include the mastery over infidelity? Or has the Cloud Heavens sect chosen to exclude that particular art?" Elder Schwe's expression remained cool, though her fingers pressed against the armrest with restrained tension. "Acting on mere rumors," she replied smoothly, "is the mark of a brute, Kale. Baseless accusations do nothing to strengthen one's position." Kale shook his head slowly, his smile deepening with a touch of disdain. "Rumors?" he echoed, voice low and almost amused. "Come now, Schwe. We both know the truth. There's no need to hide it. And fire, it burns brightest when exposing falsehoods." Marquis Venter glanced between the two, his amusement clear as he sipped his wine, observing the thinly veiled barbs with a glint of interest. He sensed that, while the verbal exchange might be over, the true confrontation had only just begun. On the other side, inside the arena, Varen stepped onto the stage, his stance poised and commanding. His eyes remained steady as he regarded the man standing before him, noting the furrowed brow and his opponent's controlled breaths, each one measured. The man's determination was evident, yet Varen knew how this would end. The gap in their power was insurmountable, but perhaps his opponent hadn't yet realized it. Such unfortunate timing, Varen thought, feeling the weight of his responsibility as the Silver Flame sect's senior disciple. This man, he's reached a decent rank, even a respectable one. But here and now, it will count for nothing. The announcer's voice signaled the start, and Varen's hand moved to his hilt, his every movement unhurried. His aura unfurled around him, a burning silver that contrasted starkly against the blue-gray of his opponent's mana. "This is not about honor for me," he reminded himself, feeling the slight pulse of energy from his opponent as he prepared his opening move. "I cannot give him a chance. This match is an obligation, not a personal challenge. I am here to prove the strength of the Silver Flame sect." As they engaged, the man lunged with admirable speed, his eyes focused and his form solid. Varen sidestepped gracefully, his sword catching his opponent's blade mid-air. The sound of steel clashing echoed sharply, and Varen felt the faintest spark of frustration from his opponent. A wasted effort, Varen mused, watching the man recover his stance. But perhaps he still thinks he can turn this around. Another strike, this time with greater force, cut through the air toward him. Varen countered effortlessly, his silvery mana swirling around him in controlled bursts. His blade met the strike, redirecting it without an ounce of hesitation. The ease with which he moved spoke volumes, each step light. "He's giving everything," Varen observed, But against me, effort alone cannot bridge the chasm between us. He deserves to know where he stands, even if it means facing defeat. Seeing his opponent falter, Varen pushed forward, his movements gaining momentum as he closed the gap. When the man finally attempted a desperate, overhead strike, Varen didn't hesitate. He sidestepped, his own sword flashing as he knocked the man's weapon from his grip in one decisive stroke. As his opponent stumbled back, disarmed and defeated, Varen caught the look in his eyes, resentment mixed with reluctant respect. "Sigh, have a better luck next time," he could only mumble to himself. "But not bad. Definitely qualified for a recommendation." Varen took a quiet breath, his gaze still locked on his disarmed opponent, who looked up at him with a fire that hadn't quite dimmed, despite the swift defeat. There was something in the man's stance, a resilience, an unyielding spark that spoke of a martial spirit far from shattered. Varen nodded slightly, a rare hint of approval flickering in his eyes as he inclined his head. "You?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying an undertone of curiosity. "What is your name?" The man straightened, meeting Varen's gaze directly, his voice steady and filled with unwavering vitality. "My name is Hao Run." Hearing the strength behind his words, Varen's lips curved into a faint smile. "Good," he mused to himself. Even a loss hasn't quenched his resolve. This one spirit still burns strong. He stored the name in the corner of his mind, quietly impressed. This Hao Run had potential, and though he had lost today, the future held many roads yet. With a final nod, Varen turned and left the stage, his silvery red robe catching the light as he moved. The spectators' eyes remained on him, their murmurs a mixture of awe and respect, as he returned to the place where his junior disciples gathered. Chapter 202, Tournament. Valeria. While the tournament was progressing, on the one hand, inside the area reserved for female fighters, Valeria tightened the straps of her armor, her gaze steady and focused. The preparation space was clean and relatively quiet, the sounds of the ongoing battles outside muffled by thick walls. She took a steadying breath, savoring the calm. This area, unlike the bustling spaces filled with male fighters, felt like a sanctuary. Few came here, especially close combatants like herself. "At least I can prepare in peace," she thought, appreciating the solitude. Though the strength of an awakened wasn't determined by gender, it was true that most female awakened chose to master magic over melee. As a result, the close combatants here were few and far between, and Valeria was grateful for the space this afforded her. It allowed her time to center herself, to focus on the match ahead without distraction. At least, compared to the male prepping room which was filled to the brim, with the smell of sweat and other things, this one was much better. "It's not as if I mind it," Valeria thought, briefly comparing her preparation room to the crowded, humid space set aside for the male fighters. The smell of sweat, the clamor, the gritty, unfiltered atmosphere that came with the territory of warriors. She didn't find any of it unpleasant. She understood it as the byproduct of hard work, of hours spent training and pushing oneself to the limit. But she was still meticulous about keeping herself clean. Being a knight wasn't an excuse to neglect her hygiene. She had always held herself to high standards in every regard. Clean armor, clean gear, and a clear mind were all part of her preparation. Just as she'd spent hours polishing her sword, she took care in keeping herself presentable, though it wasn't out of vanity. It was about respect and discipline. With a steadying breath, Valeria closed her eyes, centering herself, pushing away stray thoughts of cleanliness or routine. This was her first time facing something like this alone. She'd fought countless battles and sparred against formidable opponents, but during those times, she had always known her family's knights stood by her side, ready if needed. Here, however, she was solely responsible for herself, and the weight of that reality settled on her shoulders. "It's nothing," she told herself, feeling the faint unease but keeping it tightly controlled. "This is just another fight. Like any other." Her fingers brushed the hilt of her sword, grounding her as she steadied her breathing. She couldn't afford distractions, not from the noise of the crowd, not from thoughts of Lucavian, and certainly not from the small flickers of doubt that surfaced in moments like these. I've trained my whole life. There's nothing to be uneasy about, she thought, her jaw tightening in determination. Contestant Valeria. Just then a voice echoed through the preparation room, calling her name with a booming resonance that left no room for hesitation. Valeria straightened, exhaling slowly as she stepped toward the arena entrance. Each step felt deliberate, grounding her as she readied herself for what lay ahead. The moment she emerged into the open, a wave of noise washed over her. The roar of the crowd, the cheers, and the clash of metal on metal from the surrounding fights. The stands were filled with spectators, their faces blurred together in the excitement and chaos. She scanned the crowd briefly, feeling an odd sense of pressure settle around her. Though fights were happening all around, she couldn't shake the sensation that eyes were on her, sizing her up, watching her every move. Focus, she reminded herself, brushing the thought aside as best as she could. It was easy to fall into the trap of thinking the crowd's attention was directed solely at her. But in truth, most of them were likely engrossed in the other matches. Still, the feeling lingered, a mix of anticipation and self-consciousness that set her nerves alight. As Valeria scanned the crowd, trying to center herself, her eyes caught on a familiar figure, seated casually amidst the spectators. Her breath hitched, her jaw clenching as recognition dawned. There he was, Lucavian, seated among the spectators with that same infuriating smile plastered across his face. He looked utterly at ease, his posture relaxed, arms draped over the back of his chair, as if he were merely lounging in a park instead of watching an arena full of clashing warriors. His gaze was unmistakably fixed on her, and the glint of amusement in his eyes made her blood boil. Of course he'd be watching, she thought, annoyance flaring. Probably just waiting to see me slip up, so he can rub it in later. She tried to ignore him, tried to focus on her opponent who would soon step forward. But Lucavian's presence seemed to loom larger than life, his expression a silent challenge, as if daring her to prove herself. Fine then, she told herself, her grip tightening on her sword. Yet little did she notice that, as she shifted her focus back to the arena, the lingering irritation from Lucavian's smirk gradually dulled the restlessness she had felt moments before. Without realizing it, her earlier unease had faded, replaced by an unexpected sense of calm. His presence, frustrating as it was, had redirected her thoughts, grounding her in a strange way. Let him watch, she thought, her pulse steadying as her grip on her sword became more confident. If he's here to see me fight, I'll make sure he doesn't forget it. The energy from the crowd and the intensity of the arena faded to the background. Her thoughts centered now not on the noise, but on the steady rhythm of her own heartbeat. Lucavian's infuriating confidence acted like an anchor, something familiar amidst the chaos. She didn't notice her shoulders relaxing, her stance becoming looser yet more focused. There was no more room for nerves or doubts. Just then, her opponent made his appearance. He was a slightly elderly fighter, with silver streaks in his hair and the strong, steady posture of a seasoned warrior. A long sword hung at his waist, and his aura indicated the power of a peak 2-star awakened, not one to be underestimated. A small sigh of relief escaped her lips as she assessed him. Though skilled, he was not as overwhelming a presence as some of the other fighters she'd seen in the tournament. The man's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing as he took in her reaction. It seemed her quiet exhalation had not gone unnoticed. His jaw set, and a deep scowl crossed his face, lines of irritation marring his otherwise dignified features. "Girl, are you looking down on me?" His voice carried a rough edge, disdain evident in his tone. Valeria's eyes widened slightly, realizing her mistake. "No, that wasn't my intent," she replied, her voice steady, but her words didn't seem to ease the older warrior's mood. He took her measured tone as further disrespect. "Humph, you look like a spoiled brat," he muttered, loud enough for her to hear, his gaze hardening. "I've fought in dozens of battles, while you've probably spent more time polishing that sword than actually using it." Her grip on her Zweihander tightened, but she kept her expression calm, letting his insults wash over her without reaction. His words, though meant to provoke, only served to clarify her focus. Let him think what he wants. It'll change soon enough. Start. The announcer's voice echoed across the arena, signaling the start of the match, and the crowd's cheering rose to a fever pitch. The man unsheathed his long sword, his stance wide and low, indicating his readiness. Valeria raised her sword, mirroring his intensity. They circled each other, each movement deliberate, measured. Her eyes never left him, studying the tension in his posture. The way his gaze flicked to her feet, her grip, every detail revealing his experience. Swoosh! Without warning, he lunged forward, his long sword arcing toward her side with surprising speed for someone his age. Valeria sidestepped the blow, her movements fluid and controlled, her Zweihander swinging to parry the strike. Clank! Their blades met with a loud clang, and she felt the force of his attack reverberate up her arms. He was strong, his experience evident in the precision of his strike, but Valeria held her ground, her own stance unwavering. He pressed forward, his strikes relentless, his long sword sweeping in powerful arcs. Valeria parried each blow, her breaths controlled as she moved with purpose. His attacks were steady and forceful, but as she defended herself, she noticed a rhythm, a slight predictability to his movements. He's relying on power and experience, she thought, her confidence growing with each deflected strike. But he doesn't vary his approach much. As the man's eyes narrowed, his expression hardened, and a faint glint of mana flared along the length of his blade. He charged forward with renewed vigor, his sword arcing toward her with deadly intent. Valeria's grip tightened around her Zweihander as she focused her own mana, channeling it through her arms and into her sword. The familiar warmth of power surged within her, igniting the blade in a soft, radiant glow. She steadied herself, anticipation threading through her stance as she waited for his approach. His blade came down in a powerful mana-fueled strike, but Valeria moved with purpose, deflecting his sword with a precise twist of her wrists. The force of his attack diverted. She sidestepped, her mind flashing back to her duel with Lucavian. She remembered how he had used her own momentum against her, his movements effortlessly dismantling her guard. Just like Lucavian, with a subtle shift, she guided the man's weight forward, twisting her sword to redirect his momentum past her. It wasn't perfect, but the effect was enough. His stance faltered as he stumbled forward, thrown off balance by his own strength. Seizing the opening, Valeria pivoted, her stance grounding her as she channeled mana down through her legs. She drove her heel into his side with a powerful, mana-fueled kick. The impact sent him hurtling back, his body lifting off the ground before he crashed to the arena floor, the sound of his fall echoing in the silence that followed. She stepped forward, her Zweihander steady in her hands as she leveled its gleaming edge right at his throat. Her violet gaze met his, her breath controlled and her stance unwavering. And though she said nothing, the message was clear. The man, dazed and breathless, could do little more than stare up at her in shock. Chapter 203 Real. After Valeria's victorious fight, the exhilaration simmered beneath her calm exterior. She held her Zweihander with confidence, its gleaming edge still casting a faint sheen under the arena lights. Lowering it, she spared one last look at her defeated opponent, then scanned the crowd for that familiar smirk, fully expecting Lucavian's face to appear somewhere in the vast sea of spectators. But he was gone. The spot where he had been lounging only moments before was now conspicuously empty, as if he'd vanished without a trace. Valeria felt a faint flicker of irritation, one she suppressed just as quickly as it had come. Typical of him, she thought, her lips tightening, always drifting in and out as it suited him, never quite where she expected him to be, and never entirely absent from her thoughts, even when she wished he would be. She turned back toward the exit, the lingering tension of the fight easing from her body. With each step away from the arena, she refocused, allowing herself to settle into the familiar rhythm of her breath. Today had proven she was capable of fighting her own battles, of holding her own ground without anyone's support, even without the quietly maddening presence of that bastard Lucavian. She then stepped into the changing room, letting the heavy door shut behind her with a dull thud. The quiet within the room offered a stark contrast to the roaring arena outside, giving her a moment to finally breathe. She removed her armor piece by piece, her fingers still buzzing with the aftermath of battle. She let her hand rest on the hilt of her Zweihander one last time before setting it down. The weight of the blade was as familiar, steadying her as she slipped out of her battle-worn attire and began changing into her more comfortable clothes. Her tunic and trousers felt like a release from the confining armor, letting her move freely, unburdened by the heaviness of steel and leather. As she fastened her belt, she couldn't ignore the faint annoyance simmering just below the surface. It wasn't about the fight or even her opponent's belittling remarks. Those were nothing she hadn't dealt with before. No, this was something else, a frustration that gnawed at her thoughts, all because of a certain missing observer. Of course, he'd leave before the end, she thought, brushing out the last of the stray locks that had come loose during the fight. Her irritation swelled again at the memory of Lucavian's relaxed smirk, the way he'd looked at her from the stands with that infuriatingly amused expression. He'd seemed so certain that he understood her, confident in his assessment, almost as if he was waiting for her to make some kind of mistake. But then he'd simply vanished. Typical. Leaving before the finale, she muttered under her breath, securing her sword to her side. Seems he's as impatient as he is smug. She brushed it off with a small exhale, focusing instead on the satisfaction of her recent victory. She had proven herself, and nothing, not even Lucavian's unpredictability, could diminish that. Just as she pushed open the door, voices trickled through the narrow hallway, their calm cadence familiar yet carrying a subtle intensity. She recognized them almost immediately, the Cloud Heaven's sect disciples. They were moving down the corridor in quiet conversation, each step carrying the collective grace of disciplined training. Their dark blue robes, embroidered with golden thread, caught the light as they walked, marking them with the prestige of their sect. Valeria's shoulders straightened as she met their gaze, her own expression reserved. She had turned down an invitation from their senior disciple to share a meal previously, a decision that had left her with an unsettled feeling. Now, that same unease stirred within her as she faced them again. A younger disciple stepped forward with an unassuming grace, bowing her head slightly. Her expression was polite, though her eyes held a glimmer of admiration. "Miss Valeria," she began, her tone respectful yet earnest. "I had the honor of watching your fight. You were exceptional." Valeria nodded, accepting the praise with a slight inclination of her head. "Thank you," she replied, keeping her tone neutral. Compliments were familiar, yet the reverence in this disciple's words felt weighted, almost as though it held an expectation. The girl continued, her gaze steady. "Our senior disciple mentioned she'd offered to accompany you for a meal before," she said, her voice gentle but probing. "She thought you might appreciate her guidance in matters here in the city. And that the offer still stands." Valeria's lips pressed into a thin line. The offer sounded innocuous enough, and the disciple's expression was sincere. Yet, there was an undercurrent, a quiet insistence, as though they wanted something beyond mere companionship. The disciple offered a gentle, almost shy smile, her expression carrying a hint of warmth that softened her composed demeanor. "If it's all right with you, Miss Valeria," she continued, her voice low and unassuming, "I'd really like to get to know you better. There aren't many female warriors like us, especially outside the disciples of Cloud Heaven's sect. It would be good if we could stick together." Valeria considered the girl's words, her mind weighing the possibilities. There was truth in what the disciple said. Strong female warriors were indeed rare, and forming alliances, even casual connections, could prove valuable in the long run. Normally, Valeria would welcome the opportunity to foster camaraderie with others who shared her path, finding comfort in their similar struggles and aspirations, as she helped quite a lot of young girls when she traveled. The girl's sincerity was clear, and Valeria could tell she genuinely admired her. Or at least that will be how it looked. Something held her back. A quiet but unyielding instinct that flickered at the edge of her mind, urging caution. Why do I feel like this? It was subtle but insistent, a warning that settled just beneath her thoughts, stirring an inexplicable unease. She'd felt it before, the first time she had met the group and declined their invitation. Now the sensation returned, a faint prickle along her spine that whispered of something she couldn't quite place. But what to do? If she were to refuse once again, that would mean a clear disregard for the Cloud Heavens sect. But at the same time, she really did not want to. Really? Why now of all times? Her gaze lingered on the disciple's hopeful face, and she forced a polite smile. I'm honored by the invitation, Valeria said slowly. And then just as she opened her mouth once again, still unsure of her answer, a sudden warmth pressed against her side, and an arm slipped around her shoulders, drawing her close. The move was so swift, so unexpected, that she barely had time to register the sensation, let alone react. The faintest hint of familiar sandalwood and mint teased her senses, and she tensed instantly. Apologies, ladies, came the smooth, unhurried voice beside her, carrying an air of effortless charm. Lucavian's tone held just the right blend of politeness and mockery as he looked at the disciples. But I'm afraid she's already engaged. She's graciously agreed to escort me for the rest of the evening. He flashed them an insincere smile, one that spoke of his complete lack of regard for any objections they might raise. Valeria's eyes shot to him, irritation simmering beneath her otherwise composed expression. He gave her a subtle, knowing squeeze on her shoulder as if to remind her to stay silent, his own gaze still fixed on the disciples. Their reactions varied. The young disciple's face fell slightly, disappointment flashing across her features, while the others exchanged looks, clearly unsure how to respond to the unexpected interruption. But at the same time, there was also something else. Disgust. It was a small moment, but Valeria saw it. A clear expression of disgust on the faces of the disciples. The polite mask the girl wore strained as she forced a small smile, but her tone carried an edge that hadn't been there before. "And who might you be?" she asked, her gaze flicking over Lucavian with thinly veiled disdain. "What, exactly, do you have to do with Miss Valeria?" Lucavian cocked his head to the side, letting a small, dramatic pause hang in the air. He gave a light, exaggerated "TSK," as if truly considering how best to answer, and then he looked back at the girl with a smirk that could only be described as gleefully condescending. "Now, that's a question," he replied with a slight shrug, his expression daring her to press further. "But tell me, why should I answer you?" His tone was soft, almost casual, yet there was an unmistakable challenge in his voice. The disciple's eyes narrowed, a hint of color rising to her cheeks. "Miss Valeria has been invited by our sect," she said coldly. "It's only natural that we'd be concerned about those around her." Lucavian's smirk only grew, and he dropped his arm from Valeria's shoulder with deliberate ease, stepping forward just enough to force the girl to look up at him. "Concerned, are you?" he asked, his voice low and mocking. "Or perhaps it's something else entirely. I noticed a little expression back there. One that suggests you're far less concerned and a lot more." He let his words trail off, his gaze gleaming with sly amusement. Judgmental. Chapter 204. Not concerned, are you? Or perhaps it's something else entirely. I noticed a little expression back there. One that suggests you're far less concerned and a lot more judgmental. The moment he said those words, the disciple's expression hardened. "A proper alliance requires respectable company," she replied, her voice tight. "We wouldn't want Miss Valeria to be surrounded by anyone unsuitable." At this, Lucavian's smile sharpened, his eyes narrowing as his amusement took on a dangerous glint. "Interesting," he replied, his tone dropping to a near whisper that only she and her companions could hear. "You know, I could say the same about those who believe they're entitled to Miss Valeria's time simply because they belong to a prestigious sect." Valeria, who had been silently watching the exchange with growing irritation, cleared her throat, her gaze steady and unamused. "I think that's enough," she interjected, her voice cutting through the tension. Her patience was wearing thin, and she could already feel the weight of the disciples' unspoken resentment settling heavily in the air. Lucavian turned back to her with a slight tilt of his head, his smirk softening as he met her gaze. He held up his hands in a show of mock surrender. "Of course, my lady," he said, his voice as smooth as ever. He took a step back, inclining his head toward her in a mocking bow. "After all, I wouldn't want to keep you from such respectable company." The disciples' expressions tightened, their gazes filled with open disdain now, but they held their tongues, likely aware that pushing the issue further would only reflect poorly on them. As they turned to leave, one of the disciples couldn't help but mutter under her breath, her voice barely audible but laced with bitterness. "Tisich, you men always defiling another pure woman." Valeria caught the remark, her brows knitting slightly, though she held her expression carefully neutral. But Lucavian's smirk twitched as he clearly heard it too. His amusement unbothered, if anything, deepened. The young disciple who had initially approached Valeria took a step closer, her face a mixture of forced composure and faint disappointment. She inclined her head politely, though her gaze lingered on Valeria's, resolute. "Miss Valeria," she began, her tone firm but respectful. "Our offer still stands, regardless of current company." Her gaze flicked to Lucavian with thinly veiled reproach before returning to Valeria, and she forced a small smile. "If you wish to take us up on it, our disciples can be found all around Andelheim. Simply say, 'Sister Zira called me here,' and they will know to take you to us." With that, she offered one final bow, her expression softening ever so slightly, as though hoping Valeria would change her mind. But she didn't wait for a response. With a brisk nod, she turned, and her companions followed her down the hallway, their robes swaying as they moved, whispers passing between them as they disappeared from view. The moment they were out of sight, Lucavian leaned back with a low chuckle, crossing his arms as he turned to Valeria. "Well," he murmured, raising an eyebrow, "you certainly attract interesting admirers." His eyes gleamed with mischief as he glanced in the direction the disciples had gone. Pure, indeed. As Valeria and Lucavian disappeared from view, the disciple named Zira's composed expression dissolved, leaving a hardened, icy gaze in its place. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and a shadow of resentment clouded her eyes. The casual audacity of that man, the way he'd spoken as if he had some right to stand beside a woman like Valeria, grated against her pride. "He dares," she muttered under her breath, her voice barely above a whisper yet laced with venom. She knew Valeria was a talent, someone of potential and skill who would have bolstered the Cloud Heaven's sex reputation if she had joined them. The fact that Valeria had shown even slight interest before only made Zira's anger burn brighter. This was supposed to have been a straightforward acquisition, but that man had disrupted it all. Turning to her fellow disciples, she met each of their gazes, noting the shared looks of disdain and disbelief among them. "That man. Find out who he is," Zira ordered, her voice carrying an edge of quiet authority. "If he's also competing in the tournament, I want every detail. He cannot be permitted to interfere any further." The disciples exchanged nods, their expressions resolute. One of them stepped forward, her tone hushed but eager. "And what should we do if he proves to be a threat to our plans, senior sister?" Zira's gaze narrowed, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth as she looked down the corridor where Valeria and Lucavian had gone. "If he's a problem, we'll make sure he doesn't last long in the tournament," she said smoothly, her tone cool and controlled. "The Cloud Heaven sect does not tolerate interference from those who would tarnish the integrity of our alliances." The disciples nodded, their expressions hardening in shared purpose. Zira gave them a final look, her lips curving into a smile that held no warmth. "See to it," she said, and without another word, they dispersed, their figures melting into the shadows of the bustling halls of Andelheim. As the whispers of the Cloud Heaven's sect disciples faded down the corridor, Valeria turned her gaze on Lucavian, who remained comfortably close, still radiating that maddening mix of amusement and self-assurance. The warmth of his arm around her shoulders lingered, though he'd removed it to address the disciples. She folded her arms, her lips pressed in a tight line. "Did you even think before you did that?" she asked, her tone cool but undeniably edged. "You touched me. And you interfered without even a word." Lucavian only chuckled, a slow smile spreading across his face as he shook his head. "Oh, don't tell me you're upset with me for lending a hand." He gave her a slight, knowing glance. "You looked like you were in trouble." "I don't need help," she replied, leveling a hard gaze at him. "Especially not yours." A faint trace of something close to pity flickered across his face, though it was quickly masked by that same insufferable smirk. "Oh, is that right? Seemed to me they were pressing you, and you couldn't just outrightly refuse them. You did not want to go with them. But at the same time you don't also want to offend them. Isn't that right?" Valeria's gaze flickered, the hint of admiration she felt buried deep beneath her lingering frustration. He had read the entire situation with unnerving accuracy, his insight sharp enough to cut through her initial irritation. It was exactly as he said. She didn't want to go with them, but outright rejection would have made things needlessly complicated with the Cloud Heavens sect. Lucavian's smirk softened as he watched her hesitate, almost as if he knew she wouldn't argue back this time. "Am I wrong?" he prompted, his tone gentler now, holding that unmistakable air of experience that she recognized only after a moment. She exhaled, reluctantly giving him a curt nod before starting down the corridor. "You're not wrong," she admitted, her voice low, unwilling to give him more than that. "But that doesn't mean you needed to save the day," he cut in, falling into step beside her. He tilted his head with a faint glimmer of amusement, though there was something more thoughtful beneath his usual smug exterior. "Just to be clear, I was not saving you." Valeria turned, casting him a sidelong glance. Her curiosity piqued as he added, "I just saw an unpleasant sight and intervened. That's it." He shrugged, his expression as nonchalant as ever. "It also works in my favor anyway." She stopped mid-step, her brow furrowing. Works in his favor? The casual, almost dismissive way he'd said it stirred a flicker of suspicion in her mind. What did he stand to gain from interfering like that? She started thinking about the possible outcomes of what he did. She started considering his move from different angles. Inserting himself into that situation had been deliberate, a message as clear as a drawn sword. Lucavian wasn't someone to be overlooked, nor was he willing to let others set the terms around Valeria. To those disciples of the Cloud Heavens sect, his intervention would seem like a warning, a subtle show of dominance and a way to bare his teeth, revealing just enough edge to make them think twice before pressing their agenda. She could almost picture how the disciples would respond. They'd start watching him more carefully, even as resentment simmered just beneath the surface. He had disrupted whatever plans they'd entertained, and if he was now on their radar, they wouldn't forget it easily. But why take that risk? She wondered, casting a brief, unreadable glance his way as they continued down the hall. His words echoed in her mind. "It works in my favor." For Lucavian, that could have meant keeping potential threats at arm's length while drawing just enough attention to himself. But why does he think Cloud Heaven's sect is a threat if that were to be the case? Why is he trying to gather their attention to himself? That was the part that she couldn't completely understand, as she could not see any reason for him to do such a thing. "Valeria!" His voice cut through her thoughts, soft yet laced with a quiet urgency that drew her attention immediately. She turned, her gaze meeting his. Lucavian's expression was unreadable, his usual mask of amusement replaced by something deeper, something that gave her pause. "Can you see what is beyond the surface?" Chapter 205, Beyond. "Can you see what is beyond the surface?" The moment he asked that with his tone low but oddly intense, Valeria for some reason felt that something was different with this question. The question hung between them, as sharp as his earlier intervention had been. She stared back at him, trying to decipher his meaning. It was unlike him to speak this way, and it unsettled her, making her feel as though the ground beneath them had subtly shifted. She could see no clear reason for him to provoke the Cloud Heavens sect, no gain in drawing their attention and positioning himself as an obstacle. "What exactly am I meant to see?" she asked, her voice steady despite the flicker of unease his words stirred within her. Lucavian continued, "You know," he began, his voice low, almost reflective. For most people, life is filled with faces that come and go. Friends, rivals, strangers, always new ones appearing, old ones drifting away. There's hardly time to truly understand anyone, even those closest to us. So we take shortcuts. We rely on instinct, on impressions that form in the first few moments. Valeria listened, feeling the weight of his words settle over her, even as she tried to maintain her guarded expression. His tone, usually laced with amusement, was now sincere, and it unsettled her even more. We meet someone, he continued, and before they've said a word, we already have an idea of who they are. Maybe it's something we've heard about them or something familiar we recognize, a similarity to someone we've known before. And so that impression settles in our minds. He paused, glancing at her as though to gauge her reaction. Lucavian continued, his gaze distant, as though he were seeing something beyond the walls around them. And there are people who know exactly how to use that to their advantage, he said, his voice tinged with a quiet edge. They shape themselves carefully, presenting a face that's flawless, almost angelic. For everyone they meet, they find a way to reflect some part of that person's struggles, that hidden vulnerability they've guarded so closely. They make people think they're the same, as if they share a bond, a kinship. He glanced at her, his eyes piercing in their clarity, and Valeria felt the weight of his words settle heavily in her chest. The subtle hint of warning in his tone was unmistakable, and she couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't speaking hypothetically. It's how they pull people in, he went on, his voice soft yet carrying an undertone that sent a prickle along her skin. They present themselves as though they understand people's every hardship, making use of that emotional vulnerability to make a profit. Lucavian's gaze held hers, his expression shifting to one of mild curiosity mixed with a sharper intent. Tell me something, Valeria, he began, his tone soft but probing. When you were talking to those disciples, you seemed uncomfortable. Why do you think that was? The question settled heavily between them, and Valeria felt her jaw tighten. She had been asking herself the same thing since her first encounter with the Cloud Heavens sect disciples. The strange unease that surfaced every time they approached her. It was as though her instincts sensed something amiss, yet no concrete reason emerged to explain it. I don't know, she replied finally, the frustration clear in her voice. I've been wondering that myself. There was nothing overtly wrong about them. They were respectful, polite, and yet, something about them made me feel, she hesitated, searching for the right word. Unsteady, like there was a hidden intention, but nothing I could see. Lucavian nodded, his gaze unwavering. Sometimes that's exactly how it works. They give just enough and seem just relatable enough that the logical mind can't find anything wrong. But underneath, your instincts are telling you the truth. He paused, watching her closely. That's often the case when people are hiding something. They're so polished, so composed, that it's almost too perfect. Valeria's brows knit together, her mind racing. Was that what it was? The disciples had been all too willing to establish some form of bond with her, highlighting their similarities and hinting at a shared journey. It had been easy to accept their admiration as genuine, and yet that flicker of doubt, that tension she couldn't explain, lingered. So what are you suggesting? She asked, her voice low, reluctant but compelled to hear his answer. Lucavian shook his head, his expression returning to its usual nonchalance. I'm not suggesting anything, he replied smoothly, his tone carrying a hint of dismissal. You seem more than capable of finding your own answers. But then, just as she relaxed a fraction, he gave her a look, one that made the air between them go cold. His lips curved into a smirk, but this one was different, laced with something dark and unsettling. It held none of his usual amusement, none of the teasing arrogance she was used to. Instead, there was a calculated edge, a quiet promise that sent a faint shiver down her spine. Her muscles tensed instinctively as his gaze held hers, sharp and unwavering. But you'll see soon enough, he said, his voice almost a murmur, though each word carried a chilling weight. You'll understand why I stepped in today. The words settled over her like a shadow, and though she tried to dismiss it as more of his typical mystery, A part of her couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting beneath the surface, something she hadn't anticipated. For all her careful judgments of his motives, she realized she was still unprepared for whatever game he seemed to be playing. Her gaze remained on him, searching for a hint of his intentions, but he offered her nothing further, and instead, his usual smile returned. Lucavian's smirk shifted, easing back into something more familiar, though it was clear he was steering the conversation elsewhere. "Now that I think about it, your performance today was impressive," he remarked smoothly, his gaze flicking to her as though he hadn't just left her hanging in icy suspense. "Your basics are solid, and your strength, well, that was no joke. You didn't leave that guy a single opening." Valeria raised an eyebrow, still tense but now with a hint of wary curiosity. "Just like that?" He had shifted topics so effortlessly, as if he hadn't just laid out a dark premonition for her to dwell on. "And that final move," he continued, a glint of amusement reappearing in his eyes. "I have to wonder, did you get that from me? A little inspiration, perhaps?" At that, Valeria let out a soft "Umph," and turned her head away, a slight smile pulling at her lips despite herself. "Who do you think you are?" she replied, her voice touched with faint mockery. "I did that on my own. It has nothing to do with you." Lucavian chuckled, undeterred. "Oh, is that so? So you didn't borrow my technique and polish it up just a bit?" He raised an eyebrow, leaning in as though ready to dissect her every move with that same smug curiosity. Valeria shot him a quick, defiant glance. "I didn't borrow anything," she retorted, her voice firm. "What I did was my own, and if it looked impressive, that's because it was. I don't need anyone's help to put someone in their place." He. "Really? Is that really the case, I wonder?" Valeria crossed her arms and sighed, choosing not to rise to his bait. "I'm not going to argue with you," she replied, her voice cool yet with an edge of amusement. "But since you're so insistent, I watched your fight too. You weren't bad, I'll give you that." Lucavian's smirk widened, a glint of satisfaction sparking in his eyes. "Not bad, you say?" he echoed, leaning in with a playful arrogance. "Didn't you confirm my strength and technique firsthand? I seem to recall you had a front-row seat to that." Valeria rolled her eyes, refusing to let him get to her. "You always talk so fraudulently," she replied, a wry smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "How am I supposed to believe anything you say?" "Oh, fraudulently?" he repeated, feigning shock as he placed a hand over his heart. "You wound me, Valeria. I speak nothing but the truth. When it suits me." She let out another "Umph," and shook her head, though a reluctant smile escaped her as she continued down the hall. His words, though laden with bravado, held a truth she couldn't ignore. She had indeed experienced his strength and skill up close, whether she liked admitting it or not. But he didn't need to know how much it lingered in her thoughts. "Well, let's just say I'll believe it when I see it again," she shot back, glancing at him with a playful spark in her eyes. "Oh, let's hope that you won't meet me too early in the tournament. That would not end too well for you." Valeria's smile widened at his words, her competitive spirit flaring. "Oh, is that so?" she replied, raising an eyebrow. "Don't worry, I can handle myself just fine. Besides, maybe it's you who should hope not to meet me too soon." Lucavian chuckled, the sound low and rich with amusement as he matched her pace down the hall. "Confident, aren't we? But let's be realistic. If we clash, you'll have to bring more than just bravado." "We'll see about that," she said, though she inwardly knew that, with this guy's strength and talent, his words were indeed true. Chapter 206. Tournament. Lucavian. The second day of the tournament dawned with the same electrifying energy that had filled the city on the first. As the morning sun rose, casting a warm glow over the arena, the grounds were already bustling with fighters and spectators alike. The early rounds, designed to thin the crowd, were set to continue at a relentless pace, as scores of hopefuls sought to prove their worth before the eyes of Andelheim. While the atmosphere in the arena buzzed with anticipation, the absence of Marquis Venter was keenly noted by the crowd. His seat in the private lounge remained empty, a quiet reminder that, though he had organized the tournament, his attention was not wholly dedicated to these preliminary bouts. There were matters of state that required his presence, and he'd left the early rounds to proceed under the watchful eyes of his advisors and attendants. The matches began as soon as the sun cleared the horizon, the clashing of blades and bursts of mana filling the air. Fighters from across the empire stepped forward in quick succession, each eager to carve out a name for themselves if only to earn a chance at the main stage where true glory awaited. Among the contestants, the disciples from both the Cloud Heavens sect and Silver Flame sect garnered special attention. Each fight they entered drew murmurs from the crowd, the underlying rivalry between the sects adding a layer of tension to even the simplest bouts. Younger disciples, inspired by their seniors, fought with fervor, eager to secure wins not only for themselves but as symbols of their respective sects' honor. But these early rounds were brutal and unforgiving. Many contestants barely had a moment to prove themselves before they were dispatched, the thinning of the crowd merciless and efficient. The officials were strict in their pacing, allowing little time for recovery between bouts. Only those who truly excelled in skill or resilience would survive these grueling trials. In the absence of the Marquis's observant gaze, the arena became a crucible where raw strength, skill, and reputation were tested. For some, it was a mere stepping stone. For others, it was the end of the line. Lucavian's eyes scanned the crowd, the intensity of the arena's energy seeping into him like heat from a blazing fire. He felt Vitalyara's presence within his mind, her voice calm yet curious as she observed the scene alongside him. Quite the spectacle, isn't it? He mused, his thoughts directed inwardly. Indeed, though it hardly seems worth it for most of them. So many come here hoping to make their mark, yet they're barely noticed beyond a single moment. Vitalyara replied, her tone thoughtful. Do you ever think about that? About how quickly people can forget? A faint smile crossed his lips, though he kept his face unreadable to those around him. If I let myself worry about being remembered, I'd be no different than these hopefuls. Greatness doesn't concern itself with validation, only with victory. Vitalyara's agreement was almost a hum, resonating in the quiet of his mind. True enough. Only those who stand at the peak will be remembered, and the rest will fade as quickly as they rose. She paused, a hint of mischief creeping into her voice. But in your case, greatness or not, it seems you already have some admirers, or perhaps rivals, watching your every move. Indeed, Lucavian thought as he spread his senses slightly. There were certain people who were observing him from a distance. As expected, it worked. Yesterday's show seems to have worked, as now he was seeing the benefits of what he did with Valeria. Lucavian's gaze remained steady as he took in the movements around him, his senses heightened. He felt the pointed stares from the Cloud Heavens sect members, their intent sharp as a blade's edge. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth as he thought. Two-faced parasites. There had been a reason for provoking them, after all. It wasn't merely about stirring up tension. It was about drawing their attention and observing who couldn't resist taking the bait. As expected, yesterday's display with Valeria had done the trick, and now he could see the fruits of his effort. Every look, every sidelong glance from their disciples, only confirmed their interest. Vitalyara's presence shifted as she curled herself comfortably around his shoulder, her gaze sharp as she observed the arena floor. It seems they're not alone in watching you, she murmured, her tone lightly disdainful. Some of the younger female disciples were indeed watching him, their expressions torn between curiosity and calculation. Vitalyara sniffed delicately, her tail flicking against his shoulder. They don't smell good, she said, her distaste evident. Why do you think so? Lucavian asked, an amused curiosity in his voice. Vitalyara sniffed again, turning away with a small, dignified humph. They reek of males, she replied, her tone layered with distaste. And no, I won't elaborate. He didn't press further. He understood what she meant. Beneath the subtle charms and calculated glances of the Cloud Heavens sect disciples, there was a familiarity in their airs, a practiced sweetness masking intentions that were anything but pure. Glancing up, he caught sight of the clock hanging above the arena floor, its hands ticking toward his match time. It was close, and he could feel the mounting energy as the next round drew near. "I will be on my way then." Humph! Without another word, he turned from the crowd, weaving his way toward the arena's preparation rooms. The male fighters' room was filled with competitors, each preparing in their own way. The air was thick with tension and the clink of armor, punctuated by the low murmur of hushed conversations. The room was crowded, as he'd anticipated. Even with his usual calm demeanor, Lucavian had little patience for the restless noise that hung thick in the air. Though knowing this would happen, he came prepared. Instead of lingering in the cramped room, he took a place in the corridor just outside, resting his hand lightly on the sheath of his estoc. "Contestant Lucavian," his name echoed, and then he readied himself. At the sound of his name echoing through the corridor, Lucavian's posture shifted, his focus sharpening. With a final, calm breath, he pushed open the door and stepped into the arena. The roar of the crowd crashed over him, a wave of excitement and anticipation, but he paid it no mind. His gaze was already fixed on the figure waiting for him in the center of the battleground. His opponent was a middle-aged man, sturdy and composed, his stance solid as he held a classic long sword in hand. The man's presence was understated yet palpable. He radiated the calm confidence of someone well-versed in the ways of battle. Lucavian's senses quickly honed in on his energy, estimating it to be that of an early 3-star fighter, a feat not easily achieved, and he allowed himself a brief flicker of respect. A 3-star, Lucavian mused inwardly. Impressive. A disciplined man with experience. The middle-aged man squinted, his gaze sharpening as he studied Lucavian. Someone without a core, he mumbled, a hint of surprise coloring his tone. It was a typical reaction, Lucavian knew. His unique constitution prevented others from sensing his cores directly, even if they attempted to probe with mana. This had served him well, allowing him to blend seamlessly when needed, even concealing his awakened status in the army. Without missing a beat, Lucavian raised his estoc, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Old man, use your brain a little bit. If I weren't strong, how would I have passed the first round?" The man's eyes widened briefly, but then they were narrowed. "I am not old. This is what old people say." The man's eyes flashed with a glint of irritation at Lucavian's taunting. His stance tightened, and he gripped his long sword with renewed fervor, his voice carrying an edge of impatience. "Who are you calling old, boy?" he growled. "The younger generation seems to lack a proper sense of respect these days. If that's the case, then it falls to us to instill that respect into our juniors." Lucavian's smirk deepened, unfazed. So easily provoked? He mused inwardly, keeping his gaze steady on the man. "Well then, old man, by all means," he replied, his tone laced with mocking courtesy. "Show me what the experienced generation can do." Swoosh! The man's face hardened, and without another word, he lunged forward, his long sword gleaming as it arced through the air. The man lunged forward, his long sword arcing through the air in a powerful strike, brown mana rippling along the blade. Lucavian's eyes narrowed as he studied the attack, and in a fraction of a second, he saw through it all. Experienced, but unrefined, the man's swordsmanship, though familiar with the basics, was riddled with weaknesses. His stance, while solid, carried too much tension. His movements lacked fluidity, and his strike, though powerful, was easy to read. Clank! As their weapons met, the man's long sword clashed against Lucavian's estoc with a resounding clang. Mana surged from the man's blade, spilling over in an attempt to overwhelm him with raw power. But Lucavian's instincts were sharp, his reflexes honed. He evaded the mana with ease, sidestepping smoothly without even summoning his own. With a graceful pivot, he rotated his body 90 degrees to the side, slipping out of the direct path of the attack. And in that fluid motion, he made his move. As he rotated, Lucavian subtly applied pressure with his estoc, tilting the man's sword just slightly, creating a small opening in his guard. It was all he needed. The man's technique was full of openings due to his excessive reliance on strength. leaving him vulnerable to someone like Lucavian, who immediately deciphered the swordplay. What? Before the man could even register the shift, Lucavian repositioned himself, his footwork quick and light. Swoosh! Stab! With one smooth thrust, he drove his estoc forward, the thin blade piercing the man's shoulder with deadly precision. Arg! The man grunted in pain, retreating back instantly with mana channeled into his legs. For a 3-star awakened, while that injury was definitely painful, it was not an end to the fight. Slash! His eyes flashed with determination as he swung his sword, unleashing a slash of brown mana to keep Lucavian from closing in on him. But it didn't go as planned. The slash of mana flew toward Lucavian, only to be cut down midair in a single, effortless movement. Lucavian's estoc glinted as he deflected the mana with precision, the energy dissipating harmlessly around him. The man's eyes widened in disbelief, his breath catching as he watched the impossible unfold. You can do that? Before he could even process it, a glint of gray caught his eye, slicing through the air with lethal grace. In the blink of an eye, Lucavian was upon him, his estoc poised at the man's neck, the cold, unwavering blade pressing gently against his skin. The man froze, his pulse racing as he felt the icy edge of the blade. The sheer speed, the absolute control, and the effortless precision with which Lucavian had moved left him stunned. Chapter 207, An Insight. The disciples of the cloud heavens sect watched Lucavian's fight with wide-eyed focus, their expressions a mix of astonishment and intrigue. Each had anticipated a drawn-out battle, given that Lucavian's aura suggested he was, at best, a peak 2-star awakened. Yet what they had just witnessed defied their expectations. That technique, one of the disciples murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might disrupt the memory of his movements. He didn't even summon his mana fully. Another disciple nodded, his gaze still locked on Lucavian, who stood relaxed, his estoc lightly resting at the defeated man's throat. He read through every move as if the fight was choreographed. 6 seconds, that's all it took. For disciples trained in rigorous swordsmanship and the arts of combat, the display was nothing short of impressive. They were all 3-star awakened, well-versed in the basics and subtleties of swordplay, but none of them could say with confidence that they would have dispatched an opponent so effortlessly. It's not his strength, a disciple beside them remarked, her brow furrowed in thought. It's his form and precision, his understanding of the blade. Even though he's only a peak 2-star awakened, he wielded his estoc like an extension of himself. They exchanged glances, a silent understanding passing among them. It was rare to see someone at his level dispatch an opponent so cleanly without relying on raw power or overwhelming mana. Finally, Zira, the senior disciple, spoke up, her eyes narrowing as she watched Lucavian's form. Skill like that, it shouldn't be ignored. He might not have the raw power of a 3-star awakened, but he's clearly someone we should keep an eye on. She looked at her disciples, her tone authoritative. After the previous day's confrontation with Lucavian, Zira and the other disciples hadn't wasted any time. The moment they were alone, Zira had quietly ordered a background check on him. Information within this world traveled at its own pace, and she knew it would likely be 3 or 4 days before any details came back. But with the tournament stretching over several days, that wait was acceptable. In the meantime, they had approached a tournament official under the pretense of innocent curiosity. A few well-placed words about one of their disciples, taking a fancy to the young swordsman, coupled with a small but persuasive amount of gold, ensured they'd get what they wanted. The official, his eyes gleaming with understanding, had been more than willing to oblige. A man named Lucavian's next match? He had said with a casual grin, tucking the gold discreetly into his sleeve. I'll get that for you. That was exactly how they ended up here, as they did not want to look at all those lists that were pinned on the bulletin board of the tournament center. And now, at this right moment, Zira had an outline of this guy named Lucavian. Heh! Arrogant bastard. Even if you are somehow talented, with your measly strength like this, you think you can act like that before us? She thought, remembering the fight. Yesterday, Zira had mulled over the encounter with Lucavian, and an unsettling thought had crossed her mind. She had replayed the incident from a more detached perspective, analyzing his timing. The moment he'd intervened, just as Valeria seemed close to engaging with them, felt too precise, too intentional, as if he had planned to obstruct them from the start. The realization only fueled her irritation. An arrogant bastard through and through, she thought, her eyes narrowing at the memory. He carried himself with the typical swagger of a sect genius, the kind commonly seen in the lower-ranked sects, where anyone with a hint of skill was put on a pedestal. His precision in the fight, while admirable, only confirmed her theory. In a low-ranked sect, Lucavian's sword skills would surely be considered remarkable enough to earn him an inflated sense of superiority. Zira's gaze hardened as she considered his intentions. Of course, she thought, the pieces falling into place, that insufferable arrogance was because he's used to admiration. And now he's likely got his eye on Valeria. Typical, really. Men like him, spoiled by attention, always see women as prizes to be won. The more she thought about it, the clearer the picture became. Zira's jaw tightened as her simmering disdain for Lucavian intensified, her inner resentment flaring at the thought of him, a mere disciple of some likely insignificant sect, daring to cross paths with them so boldly. The audacity was almost laughable, but more than that, it was infuriating. For her, who had been raised with discipline and tradition in one of the most respected sects, men like Lucavian embodied the worst kind of arrogance. Spoiled by superficial talent and minimal competition, they strayed from order and respect due to those of higher standing. Men like him, she thought darkly, her hands curling into fists at her sides, think themselves untouchable, flaunting their skills and treating everything, everyone, like a conquest to be taken. They forget that there are rules, boundaries they don't get to cross just because they think they're exceptional. The more she dwelled on it, the more her anger grew. The Cloud Heavens sect had earned its status through generations of discipline, countless hours of training, and sacrifices made by their disciples. After all, in the time when the Cloud Heavens sect acted up, at that time, the traditional values of the world were rather strict when it came to women. Most of them were not even allowed to cultivate and form a core, let alone other things. It was the founding matriarch who had gone against the will of the whole world and created the sect. She had put her blood and sweat into achieving a position in this world, which was why they could cultivate this freely. This legacy was the heart of Zira's conviction. The Cloud Heavens sect had not only risen from the blood and sweat of its founding matriarch, who had defied the entire world to give women a place of power, but it had also thrived in a society that had long stifled women's potential. Her matriarch had sacrificed everything to secure that right, carving out a space where women could cultivate freely, form cores, and become forces to be reckoned with. Every disciple who walked their halls carried this legacy, a living testament to the matriarch's defiance and strength. And yet, men like Lucavian, men who never faced such barriers, who strutted around as if the world were theirs by birthright, had the audacity to act as though they understood power, as though they had truly earned their place. Everything had been handed to them, opportunities lining their paths, unchallenged by prejudice or restriction. Zira's anger hardened into determination as she thought of Valeria, talented, strong, and with a spirit that reminded her of the sect's founding principles. Valeria was the kind of woman who deserved to stand with them, to carry the legacy forward, not to be wasted around men like Lucavian, who saw women as mere prizes or allies to charm. Yes, Zira thought, her gaze steady with resolve, Valeria belongs with us, among those who understand the value of true discipline, of earned respect. If she could guide Valeria toward their side, away from the distractions of arrogant men, the Cloud Heavens sect would gain a worthy ally and sister. A slow, cold smile spread across her face as she settled her resolve. If you refuse to follow the order of things, then don't blame me for being impolite. Lost in her thoughts, she was a little late to notice that someone stepped up beside her, the faint shuffling of robes snapping her back to the present. She glanced over to see one of her fellow disciples watching her with a curious, almost mischievous smile. "Senior sister, what's on your mind?" the disciple asked, raising an eyebrow playfully. Zira blinked, quickly masking her previous thoughts with a practiced, composed expression. "Nothing of consequence," she replied smoothly, her voice steady and calm. She gave a slight shake of her head, casting off the intensity of her inner resolve. The disciple chuckled, not pressing further, though her gaze lingered knowingly. "We were just discussing something, senior sister," she continued, her tone light. "Since we've all finished our fights for the day, shouldn't we head somewhere for a drink? There's this rumored spot nearby, and I hear some rather interesting pets gather there." A sly glint shone in her eyes, and the other disciples nearby exchanged amused glances, clearly in on the plan. Zira could feel the playful tension among them. This wasn't an unusual suggestion. After the heat and rigor of the fights, some relaxation and diversion were commonplace. After all, this type of freedom was what the world owed them, after all years of oppression, wasn't it? Zira's lips curved into a faint smirk as she felt a slight tingle somewhere. "A drink?" Then, she said, her tone approving. "Lead the way." Chapter 208. Faint but visible. As the slightly cool mid-afternoon breeze of Andelheim, which was already alive with the sounds of the tournament, blew, Valeria strode through the crowded streets toward the arena, her thoughts focused yet shadowed by her lingering exchanges with Lucavian. The tournament atmosphere was electric. Merchants hawked their wares with aggressive cheer, and vendors offered everything from enchanted amulets to energy potions aimed at competitors. Her head was filled with thoughts as she approached the grand arena, its towering structure looming over the city like a fortress. What was he implying with his talk of masks, and of people who manipulated others' vulnerabilities? She had left their exchange feeling more exposed than she was comfortable admitting. Stepping inside, she was greeted by the stark scent of dust and adrenaline filling the arena corridors. As she navigated the winding passageways, her gaze fixed on the glow of the preparation area, she noticed several other fighters already deep in their routines, focused and intent. Her own mind sharpened, shaking off the remnants of yesterday's confusion. She would channel all her focus into today's match, using the clarity her early morning training had granted her. Just as she was about to settle herself near the entrance to the Colosseum, she felt an all-too-familiar presence beside her. "Well, you seem very much in your element today," came Lucavian's voice, disturbingly close. She shot him a sideways glance, her expression hardening into a glare as she resisted the urge to sigh. "Did you come to gloat, or do you simply lack anywhere else to be?" He smirked, unperturbed. "You wound me, truly. I'm merely here to support you, of course." Valeria's expression remained guarded, but inwardly, she couldn't help but feel the tension of his presence, an edge she hadn't felt moments before. There was something about Lucavian's insistent shadow that pushed her focus tighter, her resolve sharper. Despite herself, she allowed his presence to linger. "When's your match?" she asked finally, her tone casual, though she felt a strange flicker of curiosity. "Oh, it's already done," he replied with a shrug, adjusting the collar of his coat as though his victory were an everyday affair. She paused mid-step, a brief flash of surprise crossing her face. She realized with a pang of annoyance that she hadn't thought to ask him, and hadn't even looked at the tournament schedule for his matches. How was it that he always seemed to be there for hers? "You could have told me," she murmured, half to herself, eyes narrowing as she recalled how she had assumed he'd be waiting until later to compete. Lucavian's gaze sharpened slightly, though his mouth twitched for little. His expression slightly faltered, though Valeria did not notice it. However, in an instant, he took control of it again and then smiled teasingly. "Ah, I should have told you the time of my duel, shouldn't I? You could have had the honor of watching me, maybe even picked up a few pointers." Hearing his response, Valeria felt a prick of awareness at her own thoughts. Why had she said that? The realization settled in, and, despite her best efforts, a faint blush crept over her cheeks. "You!" She shot him a glare, though the heat rising in her face made it feel less convincing. "You arrogant bastard." Without waiting for his response, she turned on her heel, striding away from him with brisk, determined steps, as if to outpace her own embarrassment. She could sense his gaze on her back, the faintest ripple of amusement lingering in the air behind her. But she didn't dare look back. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. The cool corridors of the arena, bustling with activity and focused intent, provided the perfect cover. Yet, as she moved further into the preparations area, her heart beat with a sharper rhythm, his words echoing despite her attempts to shake them off. Had she really expected him to tell her about his match? The thought lingered stubbornly, much as she hated to admit it. Lucavian remained where she'd left him, just outside the arched entryway, half shrouded in the cool, late afternoon shadows. The faintest breeze tousled a strand of his hair, catching on the cloak he wore, as he let his gaze linger in the direction Valeria had vanished. He'd seen the flush on her face, that brief moment when her pride had slipped just enough to reveal her, and he'd savored it. There was always something satisfying in catching her off guard, in finding the chinks in that carefully forged armor she wore so tightly around herself. He exhaled, an amused chuckle escaping him, hand drifting to his chest where his heartbeat had quickened without his permission. That face just now, he murmured to himself, tilting his head slightly, lips curving in a grin that was both pleased and amused. Might have made my heart skip a beat. Letting the thought linger in his mind, he couldn't help but wonder just how deep he could push her next time, how close he could get her to that edge of impatience where her walls faltered. Lucavian shook his head to himself, the faint grin slipping into something more reserved as he glanced toward the arena's outer courtyard. While it's fun, he thought, brushing a gloved hand over his mouth as though to conceal his expression, it's getting a bit harder to keep this face. The thought lingered with him as he made his way outside, moving through the bustling crowd until he reached the front rail, where he could watch her match with a clear view. He settled against it, gaze sharp, fixed on the archway where she'd soon appear. The arena hummed with anticipation, the voices and footfalls merging in a familiar din that only half registered to him. His attention was already singular, anchored in one figure. He still remembered her first duel. She'd fought formally, every step and swing calculated, crisp, and executed with the precision of her training. But each strike back then had lacked something. Since then, though, something had shifted. He could sense it in her sword. Though faint, she is changing, and this change was a good sign. Since, if she were to get stronger, maybe the fate that awaited her in the novel could change. If you want to overcome it, you better get strong faster, Lady Knight. Just as Lucavian's thoughts drifted to that future, the one looming like a dark, unwelcome specter, Valeria stepped into the arena, her stride carrying the poise and intent of a seasoned warrior. Her pale pink hair cascaded down onto her shoulders, shifting like silk as she moved. She held her sword with practiced ease, her grip firm, the blade gleaming under the afternoon light. Across the ring, her opponent took his position. He was a tall man, his figure lean but sturdy, and in his hands he wielded a spear, the polished wood and metal catching glints of light. He twirled it with a flourish before leveling its sharp, glinting tip toward her. The contrast between the two combatants was striking. From his vantage point, Lucavian could see the faint tension in Valeria's posture. Her shoulders were held a touch too high, her stance a shade too tight. It was subtle, but telling. She was still adjusting to the eyes of the crowd, an audience she didn't quite know how to ignore. Despite the fact that the stands weren't focused on her alone, with other matches drawing scattered cheers and gasps across the arena, some attention inevitably drifted to her. The kind of attention that followed beauty, especially one that bore itself with such visible strength. And she was beautiful, he noted, his gaze sweeping over her again as if to confirm it. There was something striking about the contrast between her delicate features and the cold, glinting steel in her hands, the set determination in her jaw. It was the kind of image that would inspire respect or envy. Then he noticed her gaze shift, scanning the crowd in that quick, nervous way she'd done the day before. He kept his expression neutral and casually leaned against the rail, though his attention was fixed entirely on her. And as her gaze found him, he saw it. A subtle shift as she held his eyes, the faintest easing in her shoulders, the tension rolling off her with something close to relief. He let an arrogant smirk play across his face, arms crossed, watching her with a faint look of indulgence, like an audience of one. It was almost enough to make him laugh at her readiness to let her guard down at the mere sight of him. But he held back, the thought settling into silent amusement as she turned back to face her opponent, more grounded, her sword poised with renewed focus. Well, though this kind of development is not good in the long run, for her who is doing this for the first time, she should be given at least this much leverage, shouldn't she? Or else she may just break. Knowing how it felt to be in front of an audience like this and having seen countless youngsters break down on stage as Bruce, Lucavian was familiar with this feeling. Well, show them how it needs to be done, Lady Knight. I really am quite expectant of you. Chapter 209. Tournament. Valeria 2. Valeria sized up her opponent, her gaze narrowing as she took in the spear he held with a practiced grip. The polished weapon glinted under the sunlight, each movement revealing the sharp, deliberate stance of a trained spearman. It's been a while since I last faced a spear, she thought, feeling a flicker of anticipation. She remembered her sparring with one of her family's knights, though those sessions felt like memories from another time. Her opponent today was no ally. This man carried the weapon not for practice, but with the intent to win, to dominate. Indeed, even from the start, his face was focused and he did not speak. She thought most fighters were arrogant, but it seemed this one was not to be the one to speak. Careful, Valeria. Start. The moment the shout of the referee came, the man wasted no time, thrusting forward with the spear in a quick jab, testing her defenses. Quick! Swoosh! She sidestepped, narrowly dodging the strike, her body flowing with the familiarity of her training. His movements were fluid, each strike aimed with the precision and control that came with experience. Not an amateur, she noted, adjusting her stance, her hands firm on her Zweihander. He moved with a spearman's grace, his spear striking out in a flurry of quick, measured attacks that forced her to stay on the defensive. Swoosh! Swoosh! The spear's reach kept her from closing the gap, and she realized that each strike was designed to keep her in place, to restrict her movement. As his next strike shot toward her, she shifted her weight, sidestepping and swinging her Zweihander in a swift, precise arc to deflect the spear. Clank! Their weapons clashed with a sharp ring, the impact sending a jolt up her arms, but she held her ground. Her opponent's eyes glinted, a silent acknowledgement of her strength, and he pressed forward, his spear's tip glowing faintly with mana. He lunged again, aiming for her shoulder in a move meant to exploit any opening in her defenses. Change the stance. Valeria took a steadying breath, her gaze sharpening as she readied herself. This one's no joke, she thought, recognizing the skill in her opponent's stance and the controlled precision behind each of his strikes. She would need to channel the foundation of her family's teachings. Sword of Valerian. Form 1. She murmured, grounding herself as her body flowed into the practiced stance. With a shift in her weight, she let her mana channel through her body and into her Zweihander, her grip firm as her aura aligned with the weapon's heft. Her sword moved in sync with her momentum, building the power behind her next swing. The Zweihander, though large, now felt balanced, almost weightless in her hands. The spearman's gaze narrowed as he sensed the shift, and he lunged forward, his spear glowing as he aimed for her shoulder with a controlled, calculated thrust. Valeria swung in a wide arc, her sword intercepting his spear with a resounding clank. Mana clashed in a visible spark of energy, her Zweihander overwhelming the force behind his weapon. She felt him falter, his stance breaking as his spear buckled under the weight and momentum of her swing. Without missing a beat, Valeria rotated her body, twisting her sword at a reverse angle, her form fluid as she prepared for her next strike. The man's eyes widened in realization, and he attempted to regain his ground by throwing a quick kick toward her midsection. But Valeria's sword moved faster, the momentum of her rotation carrying the Zweihander down in a swift, powerful swing that forced him to stumble back. Tisk! The man steadied himself, his stance widening as he channeled mana into his arms, the glow spreading down to his hands gripping the spear. With a grunt of determination, He pulled the spear back, his feet digging into the ground to regain balance. His eyes met Valeria's, glinting with the recognition of her strength. But she saw his resolve harden as he prepared to meet her head-on. Keep the momentum, she reminded herself, her own mana pulsing through her Zweihander. She moved forward with purpose, her body flowing into another powerful swing. The man's spear shimmered with mana as he swept it across his front, a wide arc designed to intercept her approach and force her back. But Valeria was ready. Clank! As his spear swung forward, she met it halfway, her Zweihander deflecting his weapon with a sharp clash of mana-infused steel. The impact rang out, but she kept her balance, using her body's momentum to absorb the force and redirect it. The deflection threw his spear just enough off course to prevent him from resetting his stance. Swoosh! In a fluid motion, Valeria stepped forward with her right leg, her grip steady as she swung her sword in a seamless arc from the lower right, bringing it up and across with precision and force. Slash! Her blade cut through the air, aimed squarely at her opponent, who struggled to recover from the unexpected turn of her attack. Her Zweihander's edge gleamed as it swept toward him, carrying all the weight of her movement and the relentless power of her family's technique. The spearman's eyes widened in realization, the speed of her strike leaving him no time to counter. Spurt! Valeria's Zweihander cut through the air with fierce swiftness, its edge cleaving through the mana barrier protecting her opponent. The blade sliced into his chest, the sharp impact breaking his defenses and sending a spurt of blood into the air. Her strike left a deep gash, and he staggered backward, his face twisted in pain as he fought to maintain his stance. Thud! He struggled to steady himself, his legs trembling as he tried to raise his spear. But Valeria was already there, her Zweihander poised at his neck, her expression calm yet unyielding. The man coughed, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth, and he managed a pained yet resolute smile. "I admit defeat," he said, his voice rough as he lowered his spear in surrender. Valeria retracted her blade, stepping back with controlled grace. Her opponent met her gaze, a sigh escaping him as he surveyed his own wounds, the blood staining his tunic. "You know," he said with a weary smile, "it's my unlucky day, facing a noble in disguise. Had I known, I might have been better prepared. Perhaps even brought a sturdier spear." He paused, glancing up at her with a glint of respect despite his weakened state. "It's truly a pity, little Lady Valeria. I hope the fight was to your liking." Looking at the man, Valeria could only purse her lips. Was it really that obvious? She asked herself, not expecting to be discovered this fast. Still, she felt obliged to answer, as her opponent indeed fought well. She inclined her head, a hint of respect in her expression. "It was," she replied, her voice steady and calm. "I am glad then." Valeria allowed herself a rare, small smile as she looked at her opponent, her appreciation subtle yet sincere. He had fought well, and despite his clear recognition of her skill, and perhaps her background, he had remained resolute. She inclined her head once more, acknowledging him fully before she turned away. A quick scan of the stands brought her eyes to where Lucavian had been standing earlier, his shadow unmistakable even among the crowd. But now, as she searched for him, he was nowhere in sight. She bit back a faint sigh, half annoyed by his vanishing act, though something told her he'd be waiting just outside the arena, his familiar smirk already forming. As she made her way through the exit, weaving past the congratulatory nods and approving murmurs of the other competitors and spectators, Valeria's thoughts returned to her duel. Despite its intensity, there had been a strange ease in her movements today, a sense of clarity that had steadied her hands and guided each strike. Was it just the buildup of her training, or had Lucavian's words managed to weave into her mind in some unspoken way? The cool mid-afternoon air washed over her as she stepped outside. And there, leaning casually against a stone pillar, was Lucavian, arms crossed, his expression relaxed and faintly amused as though he had all the time in the world. "Finished admiring your handiwork?" he asked with a grin, pushing himself off the pillar. His tone was teasing, but there was an unmistakable hint of respect in his gaze. "Didn't I tell you I don't need pointers from you?" she replied, her voice carrying just a touch of mock disdain as she stepped closer. Yet she couldn't help the faint curve of her lips as she looked at him. Yep, you don't, he chuckled, matching her pace as they walked. "Let's grab something to eat." "I am hungry." Valeria rolled her eyes, but the faint warmth of his presence lingered as they made their way down the bustling path, leaving the arena behind with a strange sense of ease between them. Chapter 210, Dumpling. On the other hand, when Lucavian and Valeria left, the battles continued in the arena. The place buzzed with the energy of the crowd, a sea of faces blurring together, all waiting to witness the next spectacle. The young boy stood in the ring, his small frame cloaked in a dark hood, shadows concealing his face from those who watched. Around him, the dusty ground was marked by the footprints of countless warriors who had already fought and fallen. Across from him, his opponent, a towering man clad in chainmail and wielding a jagged sword, sneered down at him, lips curling in contempt. "Heh, I smell a beastkin here. How dare a likes you show your face here, after all the things you have done?" The boy's shoulders stiffened at the man's words. His hood had slipped just enough for his ears to peek through, small, furred, with a slight taper that marked him unmistakably as one of the beastkin. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd, the familiar rumble of resentment and disgust bubbling up as they recognized what he was. The man sneered, his eyes narrowing with contempt. "A filthy beastkin here of all places," he spat, his voice thick with disdain. "You creatures crawl through the dirt, and yet you think you can stand here? Among humans?" The boy's hands clenched at his sides, but he remained silent, his eyes darkening as he fought to keep his emotions hidden. Beneath the quiet obedience, though, his thoughts seethed. "All the things we've done?" he thought bitterly, his jaw tightening. "It is you, humans, who turned our homes to ash, who forced us to fight to survive." But his lips remained sealed. His orders were clear. Do as he was told, follow the plan, and make it through each round. He could feel the weight of those orders, as heavy as chains, binding him to silence. All he could do now was fight. The man laughed, his voice carrying over the murmuring crowd. "Look at you, too scared to even answer. But I'll make sure you never show your face here again." He raised his jagged sword, the blade glinting menacingly in the arena's light. "After all, no one will miss a beastkin." The boy's face remained blank, betraying none of the anger he felt. He inhaled slowly, centering himself as he had been taught, pushing down his rage and letting only focus remain. This was not a battle of pride. He was here because he had to be, not because he wanted to prove himself to any of them. His master's voice echoed in his mind, reminding him of what awaited if he failed. With a slow, measured movement, he lowered into a stance, his small frame deceptively still, his balance poised and unwavering. The man, his towering figure blocking out part of the crowd's view, scoffed at the sight, mistaking stillness for fear. "Ready yourself, beast," the man sneered, charging forward. The boy's eyes sharpened. He knew he could not afford a mistake. Not now, not with everything at stake. He waited for the man's approach, every step vibrating in the ground beneath his feet, every sound amplifying his senses. As the man swung his sword down, powerful but unrestrained, the boy moved. He sidestepped swiftly, evading the blow as the blade struck empty ground. He pivoted, closing the distance, and delivered a precise kick to the man's knee, forcing him to stumble. The crowd gasped, surprised by the boy's speed, but the boy didn't react. He was locked in his own focus, his silent determination driving him forward, his thoughts a steady, unyielding rhythm. "I can't lose," he reminded himself. "For them, I have to win." As Valeria and Lucavian strolled along Andelheim's lively streets, a rare quiet lingered between them. Some spectators chattering about the tournament, and musicians striking cheerful chords filled the space around them. Yet neither seemed compelled to break the silence. Valeria's thoughts flitted back to her recent duel, her opponent's unexpected respect evident in his parting words. She hadn't anticipated her identity being discovered so quickly, and his respectful surrender had been a surprise. Was she that obvious? Or was there something more subtle that betrayed her? Some mark of nobility she couldn't conceal? Her gaze drifted to the people thronging around them, unaware of the inner questions that shadowed her thoughts. Beside her, Lucavian maintained his usual calm, but his silence hinted at an uncharacteristic restraint. He seemed content to let her mind wander, with no prodding remarks or playful comments to interrupt. It was odd, and, truthfully, Valeria wasn't certain how she felt about it. His usual banter often forced her to defend herself or reevaluate her perspective, something she had begrudgingly begun to value. A fleeting image of him leaning against the arena pillar drifted into her mind, relaxed, entirely unfazed by the intensity of her duel. She couldn't help but recall the knowing glint in his eye, as if he'd already known how the fight would end. That infuriating confidence of his, so reckless yet unshakable, somehow worked in his favor more often than it should. Just ahead, the warm scent of spices and roasting meats wafted from a food stall, interrupting her reflections. She caught Lucavian glancing in the same direction, his casual demeanor not entirely hiding his interest in the food. But it was a little different. He was glaring, not at anyone in particular, but at the food itself, as though it had personally offended him. She blinked, studying him more closely. It was strange to see him this way. He was usually so relaxed, his smirk ever present, his eyes light with mischief. But now, there was nothing of the usual playfulness in his face. His eyes had narrowed with an edge that almost startled her. Following his gaze, Valeria looked toward the stall to see what had so fully captured his attention. Her eyes landed on a tray of steaming, delicately spiced dumplings, served with a side of tangy sauce. Lyrith dumplings, a rare delicacy from the Loria Empire. It was a dish known for its tender meat filling, aromatic with spices native to Loria. And even though some people would make it in the Arcanes Empire, it was not a cultural thing to do. But the main point was that it wasn't exactly the kind of thing that would normally evoke such a reaction. She frowned slightly, her curiosity deepening. "Is there something wrong with the dumplings?" she asked, attempting a casual tone as she observed his unusually intense glare. And then, Lucavian seemed to come into his senses once again, as he looked into her eyes. His gaze softened slightly, and he scoffed, though it felt like a cover. "Nothing wrong," he replied lightly, but his eyes lingered on the food a moment longer before he turned back to her, his familiar grin resurfacing as if nothing had happened. "Really?" She tilted her head, not quite believing him. "Top of form. Bottom of form. Yep. Just remembered something. That's all." Valeria held his gaze for a moment, scrutinizing him with the same sharpness she might have reserved for a sparring partner. She doubted his nonchalant reply. The intense reaction had been far too visceral to be dismissed so easily. But, as always, Lucavian met her glare with unbothered ease, a faint smile playing at his lips as if daring her to press further. Finally, she let out a small, resigned sigh and stepped forward, intending to join the queue. If he didn't want to talk about it, fine. But the dumplings had clearly triggered something, even if he was loath to admit it. Just as she took her first step, his hand closed firmly around her arm. "Don't," he murmured, his tone low but steady. She raised an eyebrow, glancing down at his hand on her arm. Lucavian released her with a quick nod, and she noticed a flicker of something unguarded in his expression, gone almost as soon as it appeared. "Let's go and see Miss Iron Matron," he said, his voice regaining its usual casual lilt. "Suddenly, I feel like eating some real meat." Valeria narrowed her eyes, processing his abrupt change in direction. He hadn't spoken of the innkeeper since they'd visited days ago, but now it seemed he had decided on her tavern as their next stop. With a slight huff, she relented. "Lead the way then. But we're not leaving before you tell me what all that was about." Lucavian chuckled softly, brushing her off with his usual ease. "Ahaha. It really is nothing to worry about," he replied, the lightness in his tone betraying none of the sharp intensity she'd just witnessed. Valeria scoffed, crossing her arms as they walked. Nothing to worry about? Then why did you react like that? As if you'd seen a ghost. He shot her a sidelong glance, an almost mischievous gleam returning to his eyes. And what if I had seen a ghost? He asked, his tone teasing yet with an undercurrent of something more enigmatic. Then what, my Lady Valeria? She took a subtle step to widen the distance between them, giving him a wary look. Then I'll start worrying about your mental health, she replied with a faint smile, her voice edged with mock concern. Lucavian's lips quirked into a smile, his eyes narrowing playfully. Maybe you should, he replied with a shrug, his tone both dismissive and oddly sincere. Valeria raised an eyebrow, searching his expression. His usual banter felt different today, layered, evasive. She matched his casual stride, keeping her suspicion tempered for now, though her curiosity simmered beneath the surface.
Hello everyone. We now have a Discord server. Join us for faster updates, discussions about your favorite novels, and exclusive Discord-only content. Don't miss out. See you there. Scan the QR code on the screen or enter any of the displayed links into your browser to join our Discord.